My wife left the entire chain of grocery stores and control of everything to our son, and all I got was a dilapidated old canning factory. That night when I got home, he looked at the rusty key in my hand and said, "Go enjoy your rusty museum, old man. Stay there and cook soup for the rest of your life." I drove for hours before standing in front of it with nowhere to go. I opened the door, thinking there would be nothing inside. But the moment my flashlight beam reached the end of the room, I froze. Grateful you're here. Before the story starts, tell me where you're watching from. City, country, whatever feels right. The comments are always open. Quick note, this story uses fictional elements for storytelling and reflection. Coincidental if it reminds you of someone, but the message it carries is the kind that stays with you. The wind off Lake Michigan doesn't ask permission when it comes through Pilsen in September. It just arrives cold, indifferent cutting. Straight through the old flannel jacket I'd worn to Grace's funeral 3 weeks ago and hadn't taken off since. I stood on South Halsted Street at 20 minutes to midnight, staring at a building I hadn't known existed until 9 hours ago, holding a key so rusted it had left orange stains on my palm. I was 67 years old. I had nowhere else to go. The rusty can, that's what the deed said. A cannery warehouse at 2847 South Halsted, built sometime in the 1940s, sitting between a shuttered auto parts store and a chain-link fence with a hand-painted sign warning trespassers in both English and Spanish. The brick exterior was the color of dried blood. The loading dock had been boarded over so long that the plywood had warped and split. Two of the front windows were covered with wire mesh, gone gray with age. My son had called it a rusty museum. Looking at it now, I thought he'd been generous. I hadn't planned to come here tonight. After Gerald Foss's office, after Lincoln Park, after everything I'd driven for 3 hours without direction, just moving through the city the way you do when sitting, still feels like drowning. Chicago kept going around me, the expressways, the late-night diners, the orange glow of street lamps on wet asphalt. I ended up here the way water ends up in the lowest place it can find. I thought about this morning. Gerald Foss, our family attorney for over 2 decades, had met us in his office on Michigan Avenue with the careful expression of a man carrying news he didn't choose. He'd arranged 2 chairs across from his desk. Jackson had arrived first, already seated, already wearing that particular look of his focused, unreadable, the same face he used when closing a business deal. Gerald read the will in a measured voice that somehow made each line land harder for its flatness. To my son Jackson Calloway, I leave full ownership and operational control of Miller's Express, including all subsidiary holdings, contracts, distribution agreements, and brand assets. I had expected something like that. Grace had built Miller's Express from the ground up, but she'd always said Jackson had the head for business. That I never did. I didn't argue with that. I was a cook. I understood heat and timing and the way fat renders down to something clear and honest. Corporate structure was another language entirely. Then Gerald cleared his throat and continued. To my husband Henry Calloway, I leave the property located at 2847 South Halsted Street, known as the Rusty Can, and all contents therein. Jackson didn't move, didn't blink. He just reached over and placed one hand briefly on my arm, a gesture so practiced it had no warmth in it. Gerald slid a small envelope across the desk. Inside was a single key on a plain steel ring. I turned it over in my fingers while Gerald explained the deed. Transfer the property, taxes the timeline. I didn't hear much of it. I was looking at the rust on the key and trying to remember if Grace had ever mentioned this place. She hadn't. Not once in 42 years. The drive back to Lincoln Park had been quiet. Jackson offered nothing and I asked for nothing. I'd been telling myself all day that I was simply in shock, that grief does strange things to the mind, that everything would make more sense in the morning. It didn't make more sense in the evening either. Jackson carried one of my bags inside himself. I remember thinking that was a good sign. Then he set it down in the entryway, just the one bag, and turned to face me with his hands in his pockets. I need the house, Dad, starting this week. I'm bringing in a full restructuring team for the business, and I need the space to work properly. I stood there for a moment, not quite understanding. This is my home, Jackson. I've lived here for 15 years. It was Mom's home. He said it evenly, without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. It's in the estate now, and I'm the estate. I've already arranged for your personal effects to be boxed up by end of week. Anything you want before then you should take tonight. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He looked at the key I was still holding. You've got the warehouse. I left you the family museum, old man. Go enjoy your rusty can. Cook your soup there till the end of your days. He said it the way you say something you've been rehearsing. Not angry, not satisfied, just finished. Like I was a line item he'd moved from one column to another. I took my bag. I took my chef's knives wrapped in the canvas roll Grace had given me on our 20th anniversary. I took the photograph from the hallway of the two of us at our first restaurant, standing in front of a hand-painted sign in 1989. Grace laughing at something I'd just said. Me looking at her instead of the camera. I didn't say goodbye. Neither did he. Now I stood on Halsted Street, with the wind pulling at my jacket and the key in my hand, and 42 years of a life that had apparently amounted to this, a corroded lock on a building I'd never seen in a neighborhood I barely knew on the worst night of my adult life. I slid the key into the lock. My hand was shaking not from the cold. The mechanism resisted, then gave the tumblers turning with a sound like small bones settling. The iron door swung inward on hinges that groaned as though they resented being disturbed. I stepped inside and raised my flashlight. Dust moved in the beam like something alive. Shapes emerged, old equipment draped in shadows, stacked crates, the skeletal outlines of industrial shelving running the length of the walls. The smell hit me, oil and rust and something else underneath, something older and stranger that I couldn't quite name in the dark. I almost turned around. I almost walked back out into the cold Chicago night and drove until I ran out of road. I had almost turned around and walked back into the cold, and that would have been the biggest mistake of my life, because my flashlight hadn't reached the far end of the warehouse yet. I didn't look back. My feet kept moving toward the far end of the warehouse, not out of courage, but because I had nowhere else to go. The staircase groaned under my weight. Each step announced itself with a long, arthritic creak, like a house that hadn't been asked to speak in years. I gripped the iron railing and felt rust flake off against my palm, leaving a thin orange stain across my lifeline. 67 years old, standing in a building that appeared to be about the same age, wondering what exactly I thought I was doing. The upper floor opened before me like a held breath finally released. It was larger than I expected. The ceiling stretched higher here, supported by steel beams that ran the length of the room like the ribcage of something enormous and long dead. Moonlight pressed through 3 filthy skylights overhead, cutting pale rectangles across the concrete floor. Dust moved through those beams of light, slow, undisturbed, as if it had been floating there for decades and simply had no reason to settle. And then I saw the machines. They were lined along the far wall in a row of 6, each one roughly chest height, their surfaces the same dull industrial gray I'd seen in 100 commercial kitchens. Capping machines. The old rotary kind with the crown-style head and the belt drive running underneath. I hadn't seen that particular model in years, not since the early 1980s, when every mid-sized food operation in the Midwest was still running them before the pneumatic systems came in and made everything faster and colder and less human. I walked toward the nearest one and ran my hand along the side panel. The metal was cold, solid. The kind of build they stopped making once manufacturers discovered that lighter meant cheaper. There was a small manufacturer's plate bolted near the base, and I tilted my flashlight toward it. Hartman Industrial. Series 7C, Chicago, Illinois, 1983. I stood very still. Grace had bought a Hartman Series 7C in the spring of 1983. I remembered because I'd helped her carry the thing into the back of a rented truck on a Saturday morning when the Chicago wind was sharp enough to make your eyes water. She'd been so proud of it. "This is how we scale," she'd said, patting the side of it the way you'd pat a horse. "This is how we stop being small." That was the same year Miller's Express went from 12 accounts to 40. I stepped back from the machine and felt something shift in my chest. Not grief exactly, but that particular pressure that sits just behind grief. The feeling of something trying to surface that you're not quite ready to let out. The smell hit me a moment later. Old metal, machine oil gone dry. The faint ghost of something acidic that might once have been a cleaning solution. It wasn't unpleasant. It was specific. The way certain smells are the kind that don't remind you of a category, but of a single precise moment. I was back in the kitchen on Ashland Avenue. 1982. Autumn. We were renting the bottom floor of a 2-flat, 600 square feet. One window in the kitchen, a stove that only had 2 working burners. Grace had taken over the entire counter space with her jars and bottles, and the small canning setup she'd rigged together from parts she'd sourced from 3 different suppliers. The whole apartment smelled of reduction sauces and herbs, and I'd learned to sleep through the sound of lids sealing at 2 in the morning. I remember standing in the doorway watching her one night, her back to me, her hair pulled up, her shoulders moving with the kind of focused energy that didn't know it was being watched. She was adding something to the pot. I asked her what. She didn't turn around. "Basil," she said. "Add more basil, Henry. Always more basil than you think you need." I'd written it down later in a notebook I kept for her advice about food, because I'd already learned by then that Grace's cooking instructions were almost never only about cooking. I pulled myself back to the present. The row of Hartman machines stood silent. 6 of them, same model, same year. This wasn't a coincidence or a piece of forgotten equipment. Someone had assembled these here deliberately. Someone had known what they were and what they meant. I moved along the wall until I reached the far corner where the moonlight didn't reach. My flashlight found a desk, wooden heavy, the kind of office furniture that used to be built to last a lifetime, and usually did. It was pushed against the wall as if it had been placed there with intention, rather than abandoned in haste. On its surface sat a stack of notebooks, their covers swollen and buckled from years of humidity. I picked up the top one and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and slanted and immediately familiar. I'd seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards and the margins of cookbooks for 42 years. But the name printed inside the front cover wasn't Miller's Express. I didn't recognize it. I read it twice to be sure. I set the notebook down carefully, as if it might mean something different if I handled it gently. That was when my foot caught on something uneven. I looked down. A seam in the concrete floor, rectangular, deliberate, running about 2 feet by 3. I crouched, ran my fingers along the edge, and felt the metal plate beneath, a thin layer of accumulated grime, flush with the floor. Almost invisible. Almost. There was a ring, small iron folded flat against the surface. I hooked 2 fingers through it and pulled. The plate lifted on old hinges, heavy and reluctant, and a column of dark air rose from the opening below. And then the smell came. It rose slowly at first, then all at once vinegar and aged wine and something warm underneath both of them. Something I had no name for, but recognized in some older part of myself, the part that predates language. It was the smell of patience, of time applied to something with care, of a decision made decades ago that was only now being kept. Whatever was down there had been waiting in that darkness for a very long time. I stood at the mouth of the cellar for nearly a full minute before I made myself go down. 67 years old, bad knees, standing over a hidden hatch in an abandoned warehouse at midnight. Grace always had a way of making me do things I never thought I'd do. She'd been doing it for 42 years, and apparently she hadn't stopped. The ladder was iron bolted into the wall, each rung cold and precise under my hands. I went slowly, testing my weight on each step, the way you learn to do when your body has stopped being something you can trust without negotiation. The smell intensified as I descended that layered combination of vinegar and wine and something older underneath. Something that had been sealed away from air and light and time long enough to become its own separate atmosphere. My foot touched the floor. I turned around. The lights came on by themselves. A strip of LED sensors ran along the base of the ceiling. Motion activated, I realized, triggered by my movement. They blinked to life one section at a time, like a stage being slowly illuminated before a performance. And what they revealed made me reach for the ladder behind me, just to have something solid to hold. The cellar ran the full length of the building above. I hadn't expected that. The ceiling was low, but the room was long, maybe 80 feet, and every foot of it was occupied. Oak barrels lined the walls in stacked rows of 3 each one, sealed, each one tagged with a small label, tied with kitchen twine. Between the barrel rows, wooden shelving units held glass-sealed containers of varying sizes, their contents dark or amber, or the deep rust red of something that had spent years becoming what it was. I walked forward because I didn't know what else to do. The floor was clean. Not recently cleaned with intention long ago and then sealed. Temperature controlled, I noticed, because the air down here had a different quality than the warehouse above. Stable. Still. The kind of air that costs money to maintain. Someone had been paying to maintain it. For how long I didn't know. I stopped at the nearest barrel and read the label. Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale. Age 40 years. Batch 7 of 12. Origin Modena. Acquisition 1984. 40 years. I did the arithmetic. 1984 plus 40 years. The balsamic in this barrel had been aging since the year Grace and I bought our first house. Since the year Jackson was born. Since the year Grace had told me very quietly over breakfast one morning that she thought she understood what she was building now, and that it was going to take longer than either of us could see clearly from where we were standing. I walked the length of the room. The barrels gave way to shelving, and the shelving held sealed glass containers of saffron. Proper saffron Persian grade, the kind that costs more per gram than most people spend on a meal. Alongside them sat bottles with handwritten labels. Reduction bases aged wine stocks, infused oils that had been processing so long they turned colors I didn't have names for. At the far end of the cellar, mounted to the wall, was a pegboard, and on the pegboard was an inventory sheet laminated, updated in a handwriting I recognized. I unclipped it and held it under the nearest LED strip. The categories were itemized. Quantities, sources, estimated current market values updated. And here I had to look twice at the date, as recently as March 2024. 6 months before Grace died. She'd been down here in March, when she was already sick, when she already knew. I read the total at the bottom of the page, and my hand found the nearest shelf without my telling it to. My fingers curled around the edge of the wood, and I stood there for a moment with the inventory sheet in one hand, and the number still sitting in my vision like something had been burned into it. $12.4 million. The smell of saffron reached me then, or maybe it had been there all along, and I'd only just registered it. Delicate and mineral and faintly sweet. The smell of patience and of something worth waiting for. And I was back in our kitchen on a November evening, 1991, our anniversary, the second one we'd spent in the Evanston house. Grace stood at the stove stirring risotto, and the whole kitchen smelled of saffron and white wine and butter, and the particular warmth of a room that has been cooked in with love for enough years to hold it in the walls. She'd looked over her shoulder and caught me watching her. "This," she said, gesturing at the pot with her wooden spoon, "this is the thing that makes all the hard parts worth it, Henry. Not the money, not the contracts. This right here. A thing made, slowly made, well made for someone." I'd kissed her on the back of the head and stolen a taste from the pot, and she'd swatted my hand away and laughed. I hadn't heard that laugh in 4 months. I pulled myself back. The inventory sheet was still in my hand. $12.4 million. Not in a bank. Not in a brokerage account. Here underground in barrels and jars and sealed containers assembled over 40 years. By a woman who understood that the most valuable things are always the ones built slowly and quietly, out of sight. I moved along the far wall, and then I stopped. Tucked between 2 barrel stacks, sitting on a low wooden shelf, as if it had always been there and always expected to be found, was a small iron safe, no larger than a shoebox. The body of it was black, unremarkable, the kind of thing you could carry under one arm, but the lock was not unremarkable. The lock was a padlock in the shape of a heart, brass, small. The brass had darkened with age to the color of an old penny, but the shape was unmistakable. I knew this lock. I had bought it from a hardware store on North Clark Street in the summer of 1981, the summer before Grace and I were officially anything at all, when I was still at the stage of being afraid to tell her how I felt. I'd given it to her as a joke. "To keep your secrets safe," I'd said, and she'd laughed and rolled her eyes and dropped it into her bag, and I'd thought she'd forgotten about it within the week. She had kept it for 43 years. She had kept it and brought it here and locked something inside. I crouched down and touched the surface of the brass heart with one finger. It was cold. The metal had the weight of something that has been held many times and set down carefully. Grace had never thrown anything away, not the padlock, not the formulas, and not apparently even now, even from wherever she was me. I stayed there on my knees for a long time, and for the first time since that morning when Jackson had stood in our living room and said the words that ended everything I thought I knew, I felt something that wasn't only pain. I didn't have a name for it yet, but it was there. The key was exactly where I suddenly knew it would be. I don't know how to explain that kind of knowing. The slow recognition that arrives not as a thought, but as a physical certainty. The way your hand reaches for a light switch in a dark room you've lived in long enough. I had worn the black vest to Grace's funeral 8 days ago. I had stood at the front of St. Alphonsus on North Southport, with my hands folded and my jaw set and my mind somewhere else entirely, because being present for that hour was something I didn't have the capacity for. I had worn the vest home and hung it on the back of the bedroom door and hadn't touched it since. But Grace had chosen that vest herself, laid it out on the bed 2 weeks before she died, pressed and ready. She had never done that for any other occasion in 42 years of marriage. I went back upstairs, found my jacket on the workbench where I'd set it earlier. The vest was underneath. I turned back the left cuff, the inner seam, the part a tailor hides, and felt the thin leather cord before I saw it. Looped twice. Knotted with the kind of knot she used on her apron strings. The key was small and brass and fit the heart-shaped padlock the way it had always been made to fit. The lock opened without resistance, as if it had been waiting to be asked. Inside the iron safe, arranged with the deliberate neatness that had characterized everything Grace ever organized, were 5 bound folders. Each one bore a cover sheet from the United States Patent and Trademark Office Utility, patent filings registered under Grace Elaine Calloway, covering 5 proprietary formulations that I recognized by their descriptions, even without seeing the formulas themselves. The reduction base, the aged balsamic concentrate, the saffron emulsification process, the spice-layered stock, the herb oil infusion that had been the foundation of Miller's Express from the very beginning. She had patented them, quietly without telling me, without listing them anywhere in the business documents I had ever seen. They were hers. Not Miller's Express's, not the company's, not Jackson's, hers alone. Beside the folders sat a sealed envelope from Dillard and Associates Attorneys at Law, Chicago IL. Constance Dillard, I would later learn, was the estate attorney Grace had retained privately, separately from the firm that handled Miller's Express business, 18 months before she died. The envelope was addressed in Grace's handwriting, for Henry. Read last. And beneath the envelope a folded note, also in Grace's hand. Read the letter last. Open the bottom drawer first. I looked down. The safe had a second compartment, a shallow drawer built into the base, fitted so cleanly I'd missed it entirely. I pulled the small handle and the drawer slid open. Inside, wrapped in white silk tissue paper, was an apron, brown leather, worn at the edges, the ties replaced at least twice. The front panel still carried the faint ghost of a sauce stain along the lower left corner that I remembered coming from a particular evening in 1993 when I'd leaned too far over a reduction and lost my grip on the ladle. I had thought this apron was gone. In 1998, we'd moved the catering operation to a larger facility in Bridgeport, and in the chaos of packing up the old space, I'd assumed it had been thrown out with a box of equipment I'd meant to go through, and never did. I'd grieved it quietly, the way you grieve small things briefly without telling anyone, because it felt disproportionate to mourn a piece of leather when there were invoices to file and deliveries to schedule. Grace had kept it. For 26 years, there was a note tucked into the front pocket. Half a page her handwriting steady even toward the end when the medication made her hands unsteady for everything else. You built all of this with these hands, Henry. Don't let anyone, not even our son, tell you otherwise. I sat down on the cellar floor. I'm not certain how long I was down there. The LED strips hummed quietly above me. The oak barrels held their decades of patience in the dark. And I held that apron against my chest and cried in the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry since the morning the hospice nurse had come to tell me it was over. The kind of crying that has nothing performative about it, that comes from somewhere below the chest and doesn't ask permission and doesn't care who hears. When it passed, I felt empty in the way that is different from grief's emptiness. Lighter. Scraped clean. I opened Constance Dillard's envelope. 12 pages, single space, printed on firm letterhead. I read it sitting on the floor with my back against the barrel rack, the apron still across my lap. I read it through the remaining dark and into the thin gray light that eventually filtered down through the upper floor. I read every clause and every contingency and every arrangement that Grace had quietly assembled over the course of 18 months, while she was sick and while she was dying, and while Jackson was already making plans she was not supposed to know about. She had known everything. The last paragraph of the letter was not written in legal language. It was handwritten in the margin as a postscript. Grace had written it herself. I recognized the slant of the letters. She always thought I was the smart one between us. She was wrong about that. I folded the letter back into its envelope. By the time I climbed the ladder back into the warehouse, the first pale light of morning was pressing through the skylights, turning the dust gold. I stood still for a moment and let it fall on my face. I had come into this building last night carrying nothing except the weight of a man who had been told he was finished. I was leaving it carrying something I hadn't felt since the last time Grace had pressed her hand against my face and held it there, the solid, unmistakable gravity of being loved by someone who had thought of everything, even this, even now. The morning light came through the warehouse skylights at an angle that turned the dust into something almost beautiful. I had been inside this building for 8 hours. My back ached from sitting on the cellar floor. My eyes felt like they'd been sandpapered from the inside. I was 67 years old, and I had slept perhaps 40 minutes in the past 24 hours, and I had never in my life felt more awake. The inventory packet was still in my hands, the one I'd found beside the patent folders in the iron safe. 12 pages of itemized detail in Grace's handwriting, and on the very first page above the column, headers and the line items, and the careful notations about acquisition dates. She had written a phone number in blue ink. Beneath it, 7 words, "Call him first." He'll explain what I forgot to write down. I looked at my watch. 6:43 in the morning. I looked at the number. I called it anyway. It rang twice. "Mr. Calloway," said the voice on the other end, not a question, not a greeting exactly, but a statement of recognition. "I've been waiting for your call since September 1st. Owen Beckett arrived at the Rusty Can at 8:55. He was in his mid-60s, compact and unhurried, with the kind of face that has spent a long time outdoors and made peace with it. He wore a canvas jacket and carried a worn leather portfolio under one arm, and when he shook my hand at the warehouse entrance, his grip was firm without performing firmness. I'd half expected someone corporate, a suit, a briefcase, the language of appraisals and asset management. Owen looked more like a man who had spent his career inside warehouses and knew exactly what he was looking at in each one. He had. Grace had found him through the specialty food import network she'd been part of since the early 90s, a commodity consultant who had worked for 20 years with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange before moving into private valuation work for high-value perishable and aged food assets. He'd visited the Rusty Can 3 times in the past 2 years, he told me, each time at Grace's invitation. She was very specific about what she wanted documented, he said as we descended the ladder into the cellar, and very specific about what she didn't want documented anywhere outside this building. The LED strips came on as before. Owen moved through the space with the ease of familiarity, pausing at each barrel row, running his hand along a label here, checking a seal there. He moved the way someone moves through a room they respect. She called it her insurance policy, he said. Not for herself, for you. He walked me through it systematically, the way a good teacher presents a subject, starting with what I could see and moving toward what it meant. The 40-year aged balsamic, he explained, was Consorzio certified Aceto Balsamico Tradizionale from Modena, the genuine article, not the commercial approximation that most Americans encounter. 12 barrels each containing approximately 10 liters of finished product. At current specialty, market pricing referenced against European auction records and New York luxury food distributor. Contracts each liter ran between $800 and $1,200 per liter for authenticated 40-year stock. He set his portfolio on a barrel and showed me the comparable sales data. I did the math before he finished the sentence. The saffron was Persian origin grade 1, stored in nitrogen seal containers that Grace had sourced through an importer she'd worked with since 1989. Saffron of this provenance and storage quality, Owen said, ran between $3,000 and $5,000 per pound on the specialty commodity market. Grace had acquired and stored 64 pounds over 20 years, adding to the inventory gradually, rotating the oldest stock with the kind of patience that suggested she had always known exactly what she was doing. The wine reduction stocks, the aged herb oils, the proprietary base concentrates, each category had its own valuation logic, and Owen walked me through each one without rushing, answering questions I hadn't thought to ask yet. When we reached the far end of the cellar, he stopped and turned to face me. "She talked about you every time I was here," he said. It wasn't sentimental, he said it the way you stat a fact that happens to matter. She'd point at a barrel and say, "Henry's hands made this possible," not the business, not the contracts. Your hands in the kitchen building the flavor profiles she based the formulations on, He paused. She said you never knew that. She said she should have told you more. I looked at the oak barrel nearest to me and didn't say anything. We came back upstairs into the warehouse light, and Owen opened his portfolio on Grace's old desk. The summary sheet was clean, precise, organized under 4 categories, with supporting documentation for each. The number at the bottom was the same one I'd seen the night before on Grace's own inventory sheet. $12.4 million, seller assets only. Seeing it in Owen's professional valuation format, with CME referenced commodity pricing, comparable auction records, and current specialty distributor contracts attached made it different from seeing it in Grace's handwriting. Grace's version had felt like a secret. Owen's version felt like a fact. I sat with that for a moment. How certain are these figures? I asked. Conservative, he said. I ran them low. The balsamic alone could move higher depending on which buyer you approach and how you structure the sale. He closed the portfolio and looked at me steadily. Grace didn't want you to feel uncertain about any of this. She wanted the numbers to be things you could stand on. I nodded slowly. Outside Chicago was doing what Chicago does in mid-September. The sky pressing low and bright, the wind carrying the first edge of autumn off the lake. I could hear traffic on South Halsted through the corrugated walls. The ordinary world continuing. That's only what's down here, Owen said, sliding the portfolio across the desk toward me. There's quite a bit more above ground. He picked up his jacket and glanced at me with the mild expectation of a man who already knows the answer to the question he's about to ask. Shall we go see Constance Dillard this afternoon? Constance Dillard's office occupied the 22nd floor of a glass tower on West Madison Street, in the part of Chicago where the buildings lean toward the lake and the light comes off the water at an angle that makes everything look more permanent than it is. I had lived in this city for 40 years, and I had never sat in a room quite like this one. The kind of room where the furniture is chosen to communicate that the person behind the desk has seen situations more complicated than yours and handled them. Owen had driven me. He'd said very little on the way, which I'd appreciated. I had spent the night in the warehouse, or what passed for a night. 2 hours on a cot Owen had found in the back room before Owen picked me up the following afternoon for the drive into the city. I was still running on 2 hours of sleep, and the residual adrenaline of a man who has discovered in the span of one night that his dead wife was considerably more formidable than he had ever fully understood. Constance herself was not what I'd expected. 60 or thereabouts, silver-haired, with the kind of still attention that makes you feel every word you say is being weighed and filed. She stood when I entered, shook my hand with both of hers, and said, "Mr. Calloway, Grace spoke about you often. I feel as though I've been waiting to meet you for a long time." She said it plainly without performance. I believed her. She opened a flat tube and unrolled a large format map across the conference table, the kind of detailed city plot map that shows every parcel boundary and tax ID number. The Pilsen neighborhood, south side Chicago west of the river, the old industrial corridor that had been quietly transforming for the past decade as developers moved in and longtime residents fought to stay. She set a pen at the center of the map at the block where the rusty can stood. Then she placed small colored markers on 7 surrounding parcels, a triangle of lots to the north, 2 to the east, along the rail corridor, 2 more flanking the south entrance of the block. Grace began acquiring these in 2017, Constance said. Each one was purchased through a separate LLC Pilsen, holdings 1 through 7. All 7 LLCs are wholly owned by the Calloway Family Living Trust, established in 2019. She looked at me across the table. You are the sole beneficiary of that trust as of the date of Grace's death, which means as of September 7th, you own all of it. I looked at the map. The 7 parcels formed a ring around the rusty can. Not a complete ring, there were gaps, but enough of one to control every logical access and egress point for a distribution operation of serious scale. She was building a freight corridor, I said. She was protecting one, Constance said. The rusty can sits at the intersection of 2 former rail spur lines and 3 arterial streets. Whoever controls the surrounding parcels controls the most efficient last-mile distribution point in that entire quadrant of the south side. She paused. Grace understood that long before the developers did. She spent the next 40 minutes walking me through the trust structure. I am not a lawyer, and I told her so, and she received this information without condescension, and adjusted her language accordingly, which told me something about her. The living trust, she explained, had been structured to hold all of Grace's personally acquired assets outside of Miller's Express, because these assets were titled directly in the trust, rather than in Grace's individual name. None of them were subject to Illinois probate proceedings. There was no waiting period, no court involvement, no inventory filed with the county. The assets had transferred to me on the day Grace died, as cleanly and directly as if she had simply handed them across a table. Jackson cannot contest the trust, Constance said, and she said it with a precision that told me this was the question she had anticipated. The trust was established, funded, and structured entirely with Grace's personal assets. Assets she held prior to and separate from the Miller's Express corporate structure. His attorneys would find no viable legal theory. Grace made certain of that. I thought about Jackson, about the morning in the penthouse, about the word useless delivered with the casual efficiency of someone who had stopped thinking of you as a person some time ago. He doesn't know any of this exists, I said. It wasn't a question. No, Constance said. He does not. She pulled a second set of documents from a folder and set them on the table. 3 contracts each bearing official county or state letterhead on the cover page. Cook County Department of Health, Chicago Public Schools Food Service Program, Illinois Department of Corrections Nutritional Services Division. Miller's Express holds active supply contracts with each of these entities, Constance said. Jackson signed all 3 in his capacity as CEO over the past 18 months. She turned to the relevant clause in the first contract and laid it flat so I could read it. Each contract contains a liquidated damages provision triggered by material deviation from the FDA 21 CFR, Part 117 Sanitation and Quality Standards specified in the agreement. If the product delivered fails to meet those standards, or if the formulation is materially altered without prior written approval from the contracting agency, the damages are fixed and automatic. No court proceeding required. I read the clause twice. How much, I asked. $8.2 million, she said, combined across all 3 contracts, payable by Miller's Express within 90 days of a triggering event. She let that sit for a moment. Jackson has already begun substituting ingredients in 2 of the 3 product lines. Owen's documentation covers that. The clock as of today is already running. She said it without pleasure. She said it the way a doctor tells you the diagnosis because you need to know, not because it's satisfying to say. Then she gathered the 3 contracts into a neat stack and set them aside. And from the far end of the conference table, she picked up a separate folder, thick its cover a deep dark red, and placed it on the table between us. She did not open it. Not today, she said. You need time to understand what you have before we discuss what Jackson intended to do with it. She rested one hand briefly on the cover of the red folder. There will be a right moment for this. Today is not it. I looked at the folder. It looked back. Owen drove me home through the early evening traffic, south on Lake Shore Drive, with the lake running dark beside us. I watched the water and said nothing. I thought about 7 parcels on a map, about a trust that had been moving assets quietly for 5 years, about a woman who had understood from some vantage point I was only beginning to find exactly where every road in this story was going to lead. I thought about the red folder every night for the next 3 weeks. 3 days after I sat across from Constance Dillard and watched her set a red folder on the table and tell me the time wasn't right. I was still thinking about that folder when I pulled onto the Eisenhower Expressway heading west out of the city. I want to be accurate about that. I hadn't stopped thinking about it. It was there when I lay awake in the warehouse the first night, and there when Owen drove me home along the lake, and there in the particular silence of a Chicago apartment that no longer belongs to you, but that you haven't yet fully accepted belongs to someone else. The red folder was a door I couldn't open yet, and Grace had always understood that the worst thing you can do to a man is show him a door he can't open yet. So I drove. Go to Geneva, Constance had said, sliding a key across her desk with the matter-of-fact ease of someone delivering a package that had been waiting a long time. You'll know the house when you see it. That was something Grace had taught me in 42 years. Sometimes you just trust the instruction and take the wheel. The Fox River came into view just before I reached the town limits, catching the late September light in a way that made it look like something from a different century. Geneva was like that, a place that had made a quiet decision somewhere along the way to remain itself, to let the chain stores cluster out by the highway and keep the old brick and the elm trees and the Saturday farmers market on 3rd Street. I found Riverside Drive without needing the address. The house was red brick, 2 stories with a deep front porch and a pair of oak trees in the yard that had been there long enough to mean it. Window boxes, a porch swing, the kind of house that doesn't announce itself but simply stands patient and certain, the way some houses are when they've been maintained by someone who cared about them specifically, rather than about property values in general. I sat in the car for a moment, then I unlocked the front door with the key Constance had given me and went inside. The house was clean and quiet and fully furnished, not staged, lived, in the way a room feels when someone has chosen each thing in it deliberately. The kitchen was stocked. The refrigerator held staples and fresh produce and a quart of chicken stock in a container I recognized as coming from a particular specialty grocer on 3rd Street because there was a receipt from that store tucked under a refrigerator magnet. The receipt was dated September 14th, 3 days ago. Someone had shopped here 3 days ago. On the kitchen counter open to the first page was a spiral-bound notebook in Grace's handwriting, a list of local services, the name of the doctor's practice. 2 blocks over the hardware store, the dry cleaner, the farmer's market schedule. The name of the librarian Grace apparently knew personally and had noted as worth talking to about Chicago history if you get restless. Below the list in different ink, as if added later, the freezer has the short rib braise. You always liked it better the second day. I stood in Grace's kitchen in a house I had never been to and felt for the first time in 3 weeks like I could take a full breath. The knock at the front door came 40 minutes later while I was still standing at the kitchen counter reading the notebook. The woman on the porch was perhaps 70 with white hair cut short and the direct, unflappable quality of someone who has lived in a small town long enough to have seen most things and stopped being surprised by them. She was holding a pot with both hands, the kind of institutional-sized stock pot that meant business. "You must be Henry," she said. "I'm Harriet Bloom. I live next door." She lifted the pot slightly. "Chicken soup. Grace told me you'd arrive sometime around the end of September. She said you'd probably miss lunch." I looked at the pot. I looked at Harriet. "She told you I was coming. She left me a note with your photograph." Harriet said this as though it were entirely normal. And her phone number, though I never needed to use it. She called me herself every few months, just to check in. She paused. "Are you going to let me in, or shall I leave this on the porch?" We sat at the kitchen table while the soup warmed on the stove, and Harriet told me about the visits. Grace had come to Geneva 4 times over the past 2 years, always alone, always arriving quietly on a weekday when the street was empty. She'd brought measuring tape and a legal pad and had spent hours in each room writing things down. She'd introduced herself to Harriet the first time with characteristic directness. "I'm Grace Calloway. I own the house next door, and I'd like to know you because my husband is going to need a neighbor when he gets here." I asked her once what she was building, Harriet said, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug. She looked at me like it was the most sensible question in the world and said, "A soft landing." She said it without drama. That was the thing about the people Grace had chosen. I was beginning to notice they all carried her instructions the way she'd delivered them plainly and without ceremony, as if the weight of the thing was self-evident and didn't need dressing up. I ate 2 bowls of soup. I hadn't realized how hungry I was until the first spoonful hit, and then I understood that I hadn't eaten a real meal in 3 weeks. After Harriet left, I sat on the porch swing as the light went off the river, and the street lamps on Riverside Drive came on one by one. The town was quiet in the way that towns are quiet when they've earned it, not empty, just settled. I thought about Grace standing in this house with a measuring tape and a legal pad moving from room to room 2 years ago. I thought about every trip she'd described as a short errand, a quick drive, a day she needed to herself. I thought about 42 years of mornings and how many of them I'd let pass without asking the questions I should have asked. She had been saying goodbye to me for 2 years before I understood she was leaving. I didn't sleep much in those first weeks in Geneva. The house was comfortable, more comfortable than I had any right to expect, given that I'd arrived with 1 bag and the clothes I'd been wearing for the better part of 3 days. Grace had seen to that the same way she'd seen to everything else. But comfort and sleep are different things, and at 3 in the morning, when the rest of the town was quiet, I lay on top of the covers, listening to the Fox River, move through the dark behind the garden, and thought about all the things I hadn't had the space to think about when I was still in Chicago. Most of them had Jackson's name on them. The box of photographs was on the top shelf of the bedroom closet, exactly where Grace would have put something she wanted. Found eventually, but not immediately high enough to require intention, low enough to reach without a ladder. It was a shoebox taped shut with my name written on the lid in blue marker. I brought it downstairs on a Tuesday morning when the light off the river was the particular silver gray of early October, and I sat at the kitchen table and opened it. There were perhaps 60 photographs inside. Not chronological. Grace had never organized photographs chronologically, which used to frustrate me, and which I now understood was because she organized them by feeling rather than by date. The one on top was Jackson at 8 years old. I hadn't asked her to put that one first. She had known to anyway. He was standing on a step stool in the kitchen of the restaurant, the original location on South Halsted, before we expanded. The apron he was wearing was an adult medium, which meant the hem hit somewhere around his knees, and the chest panel covered most of his torso. He was holding a chef's knife in both hands and looking at me with the specific focused attention of a child who wants very badly to do something correctly. "Dad," he'd said, "am I holding it right?" I remembered the weight of his hands when I put mine over them. Small hands still at 8, the kind of small that you take for granted, until the day they're not small anymore, and you try to remember when exactly that happened. I had adjusted his grip 2 fingers on the blade spine, thumb and forefinger forming the pinch, and I'd said, "Like that. Always like that, and you'll never lose control of it." Grace had been standing in the kitchen doorway. I hadn't heard her come in. She moved quietly when she wanted to, which was always. She was smiling the way she smiled when she didn't want you to see how much something mattered to her, with just the corner of her mouth looking slightly away. Jackson had practiced the grip for the next 20 minutes without cutting anything. He just stood on the step stool and held the knife correctly over and over, getting the feel of it. He was serious about things at 8 years old. He wanted to understand them from the inside out. I put the photograph down on the table and looked at it for a long time. I know the year things changed. I've known it for a decade, and knowing it has never made it easier. Jackson was 22. He'd just finished his MBA program at Northwestern Summa, which he'd mentioned 3 times at the graduation dinner, and which I'd been proud of, genuinely proud. In the uncomplicated way you're proud of your child, before you understand that pride can be something they use against you later. He'd taken a position at a mid-sized private equity firm in River North, and had come home for Sunday dinner the following month, and somewhere between the salad and the main course. He had looked around the restaurant, my restaurant, the one Grace and I had built from one rented kitchen on Ashland Avenue, and 40 years of 6-day weeks, and said, with the particular gentleness that is worse than cruelty, "It's a sweet little operation. A nice hobby for you both." Grace had said nothing. She had set down her fork, picked it back up, and looked at the middle distance for a moment, in the way she did when she was deciding whether something deserved a response. She decided it didn't. I hadn't said anything either. I wish I had. I've wished it every year since. That was 2013. The year the pronoun changed from we and us to you and your thing. And I told myself it was just the language of a young man who'd learned a new vocabulary and hadn't yet learned its cost. I told myself that for 11 years. The phone rang at 2:30 on a Wednesday afternoon while I was sitting on the back porch watching the river. The name on the screen was one I hadn't seen since the morning he'd stood in the penthouse living room and told me the apartment was his now and I needed to be gone by evening. Jackson. I watched the name on the screen. I thought about the step stool and the chef's knife and the way his small hands had felt under mine. I thought about the word hobby delivered across a dinner table with a law school smile. I thought about the morning in the penthouse and the suitcase I'd packed in 20 minutes and the drive to Pilsen with nowhere specific to go. The phone rang 7 times before it stopped. I set it face down on the porch railing and looked at the river. "Where did you go, son?" I thought, not with anger, which would have been easier, but with the particular exhausted grief of a man who has asked the same question for 11 years and still doesn't have an answer. Where did you go and what did we do wrong that turned you into this? The river moved. The afternoon light shifted. I didn't pick up the phone. We're about halfway through, and I just want to pause for 1 second. If you're still here, still listening, drop the word "still" in the comments right now. That's all. Just that one word. It tells me you're in this with me. Because what's coming next, what Grace set in motion, and what Jackson is about to walk straight into, I don't think you'll see it coming. One last thing, the story ahead contains some fictional elements shaped to carry something worth hearing. If that's not for you, no hard feelings. This is a good place to stop. But if you're staying, keep listening, The table still sat. Constance had told me to read the trade papers. She'd said it at the end of our meeting in the loop, almost as an afterthought, or what seemed like an afterthought, though I'd learned by then that nothing Constance said was accidental. Follow the news, she'd told me. Grace said you'll know when it starts. So I started each morning at the kitchen table in Geneva, with coffee and the digital edition of the Chicago Food Industry Weekly, reading about distribution contracts and supplier negotiations and the slow institutional churn of an industry I'd spent 40 years inside without ever quite learning to speak its language. The river was gray outside by that point, October gray, the color of a sky that has made up its mind about winter. And I read with the focused attention of a man who doesn't know what he's waiting for, but has been told it's coming. I found out on a Monday morning in the first week of October. The headline was on page 3 of the trade section. Miller's Express announces bold reformulation strategy. Modern efficiency meets legacy flavor. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time the way you reread something when your mind refuses to accept it on the first pass. Jackson had convened a supplier briefing the previous Thursday. The article quoted him directly, confident corporate, the language of a man who has convinced himself that efficiency is wisdom. He announced that Miller's Express would be modernizing its core product formulations across all 3 government contract lines, transitioning to what he called contemporary ingredient profiles that would reduce production costs by an estimated 31%, while preserving the essential character of the original recipes. The phrase essential character sat in my chest like a stone. Those formulas were Grace's. 40 years of iteration and refinement built on flavor profiles she and I had developed in that first rented kitchen on Ashland Avenue. Tested batch by batch, adjusted season by season. They weren't ingredient lists. They were the accumulated judgment of 2 people who had spent their lives learning what food should taste like when it was made with care. You couldn't replace them with contemporary ingredient profiles and preserve anything essential. You could only replace them. I called Dottie Crane before 8 o'clock. Dorothy Crane Dottie, to everyone who knew her, had been Grace's operations manager at Miller's Express for 19 years. She was in her mid-50s, methodical, with the institutional memory of someone who had processed every purchase order and supplier contract the company had issued since 2005. Grace had trusted her with things she hadn't trusted anyone else, including me, and I'd understood for years that this was not a slight, but a practical decision. Dottie knew where every document lived and what it meant, and Grace had made sure of that deliberately. 2 years ago, Grace had brought Dottie into something larger. When Grace first heard Jackson and Burke Stemmons discussing their plans in a conference call, Grace wasn't supposed to be on. She'd gone to Dottie the following morning. Together, quietly, they'd begun building a record emails meeting, minutes, supplier, correspondence, wire transfer documentation. Dottie had filed a formal whistleblower disclosure with the FBI under the False Claims Act, 14 months ago, coordinated through Constance's office. She picked up on the second ring. I saw it, she said before I could speak. Tell me what you know, she told me. Jackson had signed a supply agreement with a manufacturer called Stemmons. Ingredient Solutions, Burke Stemmons Company, 6 weeks earlier. The agreement replaced 4 of the 5 core ingredient sources specified in the government contracts. The substitutions weren't minor adjustments. 2 of the replacement compounds had never been tested against the FDA 21 CFR Part 117 sanitation and quality standards written into the Cook County and Chicago Public Schools contracts. A third substitution, a thickening agent, was explicitly prohibited under the Illinois DOC Nutritional Services Agreement. He signed it himself, Dottie said. Burke drafted it. Jackson didn't have it reviewed by outside counsel. I thought about the clause Constance had shown me in her office. Material deviation from specified formulations without prior written approval from the contracting agency. Grace had insisted on that language. I remembered now that Jackson had complained about it. When he took over as CEO, had called it unnecessarily restrictive at a board meeting I'd attended as a courtesy. Grace had said nothing. She had just made sure the clause stayed in. Constance called at 11:15. She didn't open with pleasantries. The auditors confirmed this morning 7 violations across the 3 contract lines. The contracting agencies have been notified as of 9 a.m. A pause. The liquidated damages clause has been activated. Miller's Express has 90 days to pay $8.2 million, or the debt goes to collections with the county and state attorneys. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the river. Jackson signed those contracts himself, Constance said. Every word of that penalty clause is Grace's language. She had it written that way in 2019 when she was still running the company. She told me at the time she hoped it would never be needed. Another pause, and then more quietly, she also told me she suspected it would be. Does he know yet? I asked. His attorney received formal notice this morning. He knows. I expected to feel something else. I'm not sure what relief, perhaps, or the satisfaction of a wrong being corrected. The clean resolution that justice is supposed to produce when it finally arrives. I didn't feel those things. What I felt was tired, and sad in a way that sat differently from grief. Not the sadness of loss, but the sadness of confirmation. The sadness of having hope somewhere in the part of yourself that doesn't know better, that you were wrong about how things were going to go. I thought about Jackson at 22, sitting across a restaurant table and calling 40 years of work a hobby. I thought about him at 33, signing his name to contracts he hadn't read carefully, trusting a man who was using him as much as he was using that man. I thought about the step stool and the chef's knife and the small hands I'd held in mine in that kitchen on South Holstead a long time ago. This was not a victory. It was what it looked like when a father watches his son walk into a room that has been locked from the outside for 20 years and realizes the son never knew the door was already closed when he chose to walk through it. Jackson found me after 14 days. Constance had warned me he would come. She'd said it the same way she said most things plainly, without softening, when we spoke after the liquidated damages notice went out. He'll find you, she'd said. Men like Jackson don't stay still when the ground moves under them. What she hadn't told me was that he'd bring a lawyer. I was at the kitchen table when the car pulled up, a black sedan, Chicago plates, parking too precisely in front of the house for someone who'd arrived by accident. I watched through the window. Jackson got out first. He was wearing a coat. I didn't recognize the kind of coat that costs more than it should. And he moved across the yard with the brisk efficiency of a man who has convinced himself that momentum is the same thing as control. The other man followed, mid-40s, carrying a leather portfolio, the careful, neutral expression of someone paid to have no readable feelings about anything. I opened the door before they reached the porch. How did you find me? I asked. Jackson's jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't difficult. I hired someone. He said it without apology, as if locating his father through a private investigator was an unremarkable administrative step, which meant a private investigator, and which meant he'd been looking for 2 weeks, and which meant the 14 days of silence hadn't been indifference, they'd been preparation. I stepped back and let them in because there was nothing to be gained from having this conversation on the front porch, where Harriet Bloom could hear it through her kitchen window. They sat at the table where I'd eaten my first real meal in Geneva 6 weeks earlier. Jackson looked around the kitchen with the appraising, slightly confused expression of a man encountering something he didn't know existed and wasn't sure how to categorize. I didn't offer coffee. I sat across from them and waited. The lawyer, whose name was Merritt, of a firm in River North, opened his portfolio and set 2 documents on the table. He was professional and clear and spoke without apparent malice, which almost made it worse. Miller's Express, he explained, was facing an $8, $2 million liquidated damages claim across 3 government contracts. That claim was a corporate liability, a debt of the company, not of Jackson Calloway as an individual. Under Chapter 11 of the United States Bankruptcy Code, Miller's Express could file for reorganization. Upon filing, an automatic stay would take effect immediately, freezing all collection actions against the company, including the LD claims from Cook County Chicago Public Schools and the Illinois Department of Corrections. The stay would pause enforcement for a minimum of 6 to 8 months, Merritt said in the same tone a contractor uses to explain load-bearing walls. During that period, the company reorganizes its debt structure and presents a plan to its creditors. The government agencies become unsecured creditors. Their claims are restructured, not eliminated, but the immediate financial pressure is removed. He set a 3rd document on the table. Additionally, he said, under Chapter 11, the company's assets are protected by the estate. Any claims against Miller's Express assets during the stay period require bankruptcy court approval to proceed. Jackson had said nothing yet. He was watching me. I looked at the documents. I looked at Merritt. I looked at Jackson. The personal guarantee question, I said. Merritt paused, fractionally surprised, I think, that I'd gone there directly. Mr. Calloway did not sign personal guarantees on the government supply contracts. The liability is corporate. The room was quiet except for the sound of the river outside, which had dropped to its winter pace, slower, heavier, the way water moves when it's close to cold. I'm not a lawyer. I've said that before, and I mean it without apology. There are things that require 20 years of study before you can see them clearly, and corporate bankruptcy law is one of them. But I have spent 40 years building something, which means I have spent 40 years learning to recognize the moment when a structure you trusted turns out to have a load it wasn't designed for. Grace had designed the liquidated damages clause to create immediate, unavoidable financial consequence. Automatic, she'd told Constance, no court required. She had believed that the speed and certainty of the penalty would leave Jackson no room to maneuver. She had not, as far as I could see, designed for Chapter 11. It was a gap. Real legal exploitable. The kind of gap that exists. Not because Grace wasn't thorough. She was more thorough than anyone I'd ever known. But because she had, perhaps, imagined a version of her son who would not be willing to take the company she built and use its own bankruptcy as a weapon. I looked at Jackson. He was still watching me. And for a moment, just a moment, I saw something underneath the polished surface of the man across the table. Something that looked less like strategy and more like desperation. You should go, I said. My voice came out steadier than I felt. I'll call you tomorrow. Jackson started to speak. I held up one hand, and something in my face must have made the argument seem less productive than he'd planned, because he stopped. He and Merritt gathered their documents and left the way they'd come, the black sedan, pulling away too precisely the way it had arrived. I called Constance at 4:30. I told her what Merritt had said. I told her everything in order, and when I finished there was a silence on the line that I had not heard from her before. Constance Dillard was not a woman given to silences. She processed at speed and responded with precision, and I had come to rely on that the way you rely on a compass you trust. This silence was different. Did Grace consider a Chapter 11 scenario? I asked. The pause stretched another few seconds before she answered. No. She said it carefully, the way you say something you've just finished confirming to yourself. That's not something she accounted for. She believed... Constance stopped, started again. She believed Jackson would fight the penalty. She did not believe he would sacrifice the company to escape it. I sat with that. Grace had built something extraordinary. She had thought further ahead than I had believed possible for one person to think had laid groundwork over years and decades. With a patience and precision I was still only beginning to fully see. She had accounted for Jackson's ambition and his carelessness, and his willingness to cut corners in his relationship with Burke Stemmons. She had built her plan for a version of Jackson that was slightly less willing, slightly less cornered, perhaps than the man who had just sat across my kitchen table with a portfolio and a lawyer, and the particular expression of someone who has already decided what he's going to do. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on top of the covers and listened to the Fox River, and thought about the thing Constance had said she didn't account for. That turning it over the way you turn over a stone you found in a place where there shouldn't be stones looking for what's underneath. The automatic stay. 6 to 8 months of frozen enforcement. Jackson's lawyer sitting at my kitchen table with the calm professional expression of a man delivering a forecast, not a threat. Grace had been thorough beyond anything I could have designed myself. She had spent years on this, and she had missed something. I didn't know what to do with that. I lay there until 4 in the morning, and then I got up and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the dark. And I thought about a woman who had measured every room in this house with a tape measure and written down the names of the local doctors, and still had not seen one thing coming. At 7:45, Constance called. I want to tell you something I should have told you last week, she said, before the meeting with Jackson's attorney. I didn't because I wanted you to hear the Chapter 11 argument without knowing what I'm about to tell you. I needed to see if it changed your reaction. I said nothing. I waited. Grace did not build only one trap, Constance said. She told me about the phone call. 2 years ago, October 2022. Grace had been working late in her office at Miller's Express when a conference line she'd been inadvertently left on connected her to a conversation between Jackson and Burke Stemmons. 22 minutes. She had sat completely still and listened to all of it, and when the call ended, she had written down every word she could reconstruct from memory. in the small, precise handwriting I knew from 40 years of grocery lists and recipe notes. The next morning, she had called Dottie Crane into her office and closed the door. What Dottie had built over the following 14 months was not incidental. It was systematic, the kind of evidence assembly that requires patience and access, and the ability to appear entirely unremarkable while doing something that is anything but. Emails between Jackson and Stemmons, some of which had been routed through a third-party server to avoid the company's internal system, which Dottie had flagged and preserved. Meeting minutes that had been altered between their first and second drafts, both versions retained. Wire transfer records from a Miller's Express subsidiary account showing a series of payments to a Stemmons-affiliated LLC that had no corresponding vendor relationship in the company's books. In March 2023, Grace had walked into Constance's office with a folder and said, "I want to file a quitam complaint under the False Claims Act. I want Dottie protected under the False Claims Act's anti-retaliation provision, 31 U.S.C. Section 3730H, before we do anything else. It covers private sector employees who report fraud against the government. No one can touch her job, her records, or her testimony. And I want the FBI to have everything before I'm gone." She was already sick when she filed, Constance said. She'd known for 4 months. She didn't tell me the diagnosis until after we submitted. I set down my coffee cup. "The Chapter 11 filing," I said. "The automatic stay. Does that house—" "No." Constance's voice was precise and immediate. "A Chapter 11. Bankruptcy stay applies to civil claims, the liquidated damages collection, the government contract terminations. It does not touch on a federal criminal investigation. The FBI case operates completely independently of anything Jackson does with the company in bankruptcy court. The wire transfers the fraudulent, accounting the False Claims Act violations. Those don't freeze. They continue." She let that land for a moment. "Grace understood the difference," she said. "She built the liquidated damages layer to create immediate financial pressure. She built the FBI layer to create permanent consequence. One can be delayed, the other cannot." I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Grace had not missed anything. She had built 2 structures, one financial, one criminal, knowing that a man clever enough to escape the first would walk directly into the second. The Chapter 11 filing, if Jackson chose, it would cost him the company and 18 months of his life navigating bankruptcy court. The FBI investigation, when it concluded, would cost him considerably more. She had seen it coming. She had simply not explained it to me all at once, and I was only now understanding why, because the plan only works if the person it's protecting doesn't know enough to accidentally disclose it. She had trusted me with exactly as much as I needed to hold. Sandra Tully called at 2:30 in the afternoon. She introduced herself as the VP of Development at Meridian Food Network, a mid-sized cable and streaming operation based in Chicago that I'd heard of peripherally but couldn't have described in detail. She had a direct, warm manner that reminded me of the food journalists. Grace had always liked the ones who ate first and took notes after. Grace had contacted her 22 months ago, January 2023. She had sent Sandra 47 videos, cooking videos me in various kitchens over various years, narrating technique and memory, and the particular logic of flavor that I had spent a career developing. Grace had filmed some of them herself over the years without telling me she was keeping them. Others were older recordings from catering events and cooking demonstrations that Grace had quietly preserved and digitized. Sandra had watched all 47 within 2 weeks of receiving them. She had called Grace immediately and told her that the material was extraordinary, that the combination of technical depth and personal narrative was exactly the kind of content her network had been trying to find for 2 years. Grace had said, "Don't call him yet. Wait until he's stopped falling." She was very specific, Sandra said. She said to wait for a signal that he was stable. She said he'd need time before he could hear any of this. A pause. "I waited 3 months after she passed. I called your attorney's office last week to confirm you were ready. She told me you were. I didn't say anything for a moment. Don't call him while he's still falling." Grace had been filing federal whistleblower cases and building television development deals at the same time. She had been doing this while she was sick, while she was dying, while she was measuring rooms in a house in Geneva and writing down the name of the local librarian and laying out my vest for her own funeral. Grace Calloway had never done only one thing at a time, not in 42 years. I don't know why I thought death would change that. I drove up to Chicago on a Wednesday morning in the middle of December for the first time since September. The expressway was gray and familiar, the skyline assembling itself out of the distance, the way it always had the same sequence of buildings, the same angle of approach, the lake appearing suddenly on the right like a reminder of scale. The city looked exactly as it had. I did not. Sandra's office was in a converted building in Fulton Market, the old meatpacking district that had spent the past decade becoming something else. All exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling glass, and the particular creative energy of a neighborhood that has decided its industrial past is an aesthetic rather than a history. Her space had the controlled warmth of someone who understood how environments affect decisions. Plants on the windowsill, good coffee, 2 screens on the far wall already cued. She stood when I came in and shook my hand and said, "I'm glad you came. I know this wasn't a small thing to do." It wasn't, but I was done waiting for things to feel small before I did them. She dimmed the room slightly and started the first video. The kitchen I saw on the screen was my own, the one on South Halsted, the original restaurant kitchen before the Bridgeport expansion. I recognized the particular way the morning light came through the east-facing window at that hour, the one that always hit the copper pots at an angle that made them look like something from a painting. I was standing at the center island working a reduction, and I was as far as the camera could see entirely alone. Grace had been in the doorway. I hadn't known. The camera was steady. She'd braced it against the doorframe, I realized, which was why there was no shake. And from somewhere behind the lens, barely audible, her voice. "That's it?" Just like that. She wasn't talking to me. I was 30 feet away and couldn't hear her. She was talking to herself, or to the recording, or to whoever she imagined would watch it someday. Sandra played the second clip, then the third. In each one, I was cooking different kitchens, different years, different light. The restaurant, our home kitchen in Evanston, the back prep room at Miller's Express, on a morning when I'd apparently come in early, and Grace had apparently come in earlier. Each time, the same positioning Grace, in a doorway, or behind a counter, or at the edge of the frame, holding the shot steady. And each time, that voice, just below audible, there it is, just like that. By the 7th video, I had stopped watching the screen. I was watching Grace. There's a memory I've carried for years that I've never had adequate language for. Sunday mornings in Evanston, the years when Jackson was in high school, and the house was loud on weekdays and quiet on weekends in a way that felt earned. I would be at the stove by 7 working through whatever I'd decided to make nothing prescribed. Just the particular pleasure of a morning with no schedule and good ingredients. And Grace would be at the kitchen table with her coffee, not reading, not looking at her phone. Simply present in the particular way she had of being somewhere completely. I asked her once why she didn't read on those mornings, the way she read every other morning of her life. She looked up from her coffee. "Because you're the only person I know who looks completely at peace when you're working," she said, "and I like watching that. I don't want to miss it." I hadn't known what to do with that then. I do now. The 47 videos were 47 Sunday mornings she had saved. Not because she thought I would be famous someday. Not because she was building a television show, though she was. Because she had wanted to keep the thing she loved about watching me, and she had done it the same way she did everything quietly, carefully, without making a production of it. Simply because it mattered. Sandra paused the screen after the 12th video and looked at me. "Do you want to keep going today?" "No," I said, "not today." She nodded. We talked for an hour about the production concept 24 episodes technique and memory, the kind of cooking that carries a life inside it. She was specific and thoughtful, and I could hear in the way she talked about food that she understood what it actually was. Not content, not entertainment, but the daily practice of keeping something alive. We agreed to nothing formal. We shook hands. She said the project would wait as long as it needed to. I drove south out of the city in the early afternoon, and I didn't put on the radio. I got home to Geneva as the last light was going off the river. I changed out of my coat. I opened the refrigerator and stood there for a moment, looking at what was available, and then I did something I hadn't done in 3 months. I started cooking. Not from a recipe. I hadn't needed recipes in 40 years. From memory, from instinct, from the particular knowledge that lives in your hands when you've done something long enough that the intelligence moves down from your head. Saffron steeped in warm stock. Arborio rice toasted dry in the pan, white wine reduced. The long process of adding stock ladle by ladle, each addition absorbed before the next, the slow building of something that cannot be rushed without being ruined. The window above the sink was cracked open against the heat of the stove. The cold December air came through in thin threads. 20 minutes later, there was a knock at the back door. Harriet in her coat, with the expression of someone who has smelled something worth walking next door for in 15-degree weather. "Is that Saffron?" she said. "Come in," I said. We ate at the kitchen table, the two of us, and Harriet talked about her late husband, and I told her about the first time Grace had made this dish, and we split the remainder of a bottle of white wine that had been in the refrigerator for 3 weeks. It was a quiet evening, ordinary in the way that only evenings shared with good people in warm kitchens can be ordinary, which is to say, not ordinary at all. When Harriet left, I cleared the dishes. And then before I sat down, I pulled a third chair out from against the wall and set it at the table. I didn't think about it before I did it. My hands did it, and my mind followed after the way it had been doing a lot lately. I looked at the empty chair for a moment. Then I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. 47 mornings Grace had filmed without my knowing. 47 times she had steadied the camera in a doorway and watched me work and said under her breath, to no one and to everyone, "That's it." Just like that. In every single frame she was smiling. 4 months. That was how long I had been carrying the image of that red folder, the particular weight of it on Constance's conference table, her hand resting briefly on the cover. The way she had said "not today" with the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly when today will become the right day. I had thought about it in Geneva in October, lying awake listening to the river. I had thought about it through November when Jackson came with his lawyer and the Chapter 11 argument. I had thought about it through December, through Sandra's office and the 47 videos and the saffron risotto and the empty chair. When Constance called in the first week of January and said, "Come in, Henry, it's time," I was already putting on my coat. The conference room looked the same as it had in September. Lake Michigan in the distance, the same winter gray as the first time. Constance was at the table, and beside her sat a man I hadn't met 60 or so, with the particular bearing of someone who has spent a career looking at financial documents that other people hoped no one would ever look at. He had the kind of unhurried precision that belongs to people who understand that numbers do not lie, but that the stories built around them frequently do. "Henry, this is Franklin Speck," Constance said. "He's a forensic accountant. Grace retained him independently in March 2023, the same month she filed the whistleblower complaint." Franklin shook my hand and set a bound report on the table between us. He was not a man who wasted time on preamble. "I'll walk you through what we found," he said, "and then I'll answer whatever questions you have." He opened the report to the first tabbed section. The red folder contained 3 categories of information. Franklin took them in order. The first was the phone call. Constance had told me in November that Grace had overheard Jackson and Burke Stemmons on a conference line in October 2022, but she hadn't told me what was said. Franklin had the reconstructed transcript assembled from Grace's handwritten notes, and subsequently corroborated by documents Dottie had collected. Jackson and Burke had been discussing the acquisition, not as a future possibility, as a plan with a timeline. Burke's offer was structured as a private sale Miller's Food, Empire the holding company that sat above Miller's Express, and the associated IP assets valued at 32% below its independently appraised worth. Below the value that Grace's own advisors had documented, below the value that any arm's-length transaction would have produced. The discount wasn't a negotiation position. It was the price of keeping the transaction quiet and fast before any other buyers could be approached. Burke would acquire the company. The Miller brand would be absorbed into his distribution network and rebranded within 18 months. The name would be retired. 40 years of work dissolved into a holding company in Wilmington, Delaware, and gone. Jackson stood to receive a personal payment outside the sales structure. Franklin said, turning to the second section, "We identified 14 transactions between a Miller's Express subsidiary account and an LLC registered in Delaware Stemfield Capital Partners. The LLC has no employees, no operating history, and no business purpose that we can identify. The total transferred was $2.3 million, distributed across 14 months, in amounts calculated to stay below federal reporting thresholds." He said this without inflection, facts arranged in sequence. I had learned in the months since September that the most devastating information arrives most cleanly when no one editorializes it. That's a bribe. I said. It's an undisclosed payment to a CEO in connection with a pending transaction involving company assets, Franklin said, which is a breach of fiduciary duty under Illinois corporate law and likely constitutes wire fraud under federal statute. The FBI has this documentation. The room was quiet for a moment. I looked at the report on the table. Then I looked at Constance. Grace knew all of this, I said, from October 2022. She knew the outline from the phone call. Franklin's work confirmed the financial details over the following year. She knew what Jackson was before she died. Constance didn't flinch from it. Yes, I sat with that. The river outside, the gray January light. My son 40 months ago sitting across from Burke Stemmons on a conference line and discussing the price at which he would sell his mother's life's work. While she was still running it, while she was still alive. Did she think he was doing it for the money? I said, or did she think he actually believed it was the right thing to do? Constance considered the question seriously, which I appreciated. She didn't answer quickly. Both, she said finally. She thought it was both. That Jackson had convinced himself the sale was a reasonable business decision, and that the conviction was made much easier by the fact that he was being paid $2.3 million to hold it. She paused. Grace understood that the most dangerous lies are the ones we tell ourselves. She thought Jackson had become fluent in that particular language. I thought about 22-year-old Jackson at the dinner table calling 40 years of work a hobby. I thought about how you get from 8 years old on a step stool learning to hold a knife correctly to 40 months ago, on a phone call selling the knife, the kitchen, and everything in it. I didn't have a clean answer. I wasn't sure there was one. She built all of this to punish him, I said. It wasn't a question exactly. No. Constance said it without hesitation. I asked her that directly. In this office in the spring of 2023, when she was already sick and we were reviewing the full plan. She said, I'm not building this to punish Jackson. I'm building it to stop him and to give him a reason to become someone else. She said she believed there was still a version of him that could make different choices if the cost of the wrong ones was clear enough. Constance folded her hands on the table. She was a more patient person than I am. I drove back to Geneva in the late afternoon south on the expressway with the city receding behind me. I thought about a woman who had spent her last 2 years assembling evidence against her own son while simultaneously building a television show for her husband and a soft landing in a river town and a legal structure that would take care of me for the rest of my life. Franklin had said before I left 3 weeks. He hadn't explained what was happening in 3 weeks. He and Constance had exchanged a look that I recognized as the look of people who know exactly what they're waiting for and have decided I don't need to know yet. I drove home to Geneva, and I counted the days. I didn't know what I was counting toward, but I had been in enough kitchens over enough years to understand the feeling of something that has been slow cooking in the dark for a long time and is almost ready. The news broke on a Tuesday morning in the first week of February. I was at the kitchen counter measuring coffee when my phone rang. Constance before 7 in the morning, which she had never done before. Turn on the television, Henry. I turned it on. The crawl at the bottom of the screen read, FBI announces investigation into Stemmons Ingredient Solutions. CEO Burke, Stemmons named in food fraud and corporate conspiracy charges. The anchor was reading from a prepared statement. Behind him, file footage of a Chicago commercial building I didn't recognize. And then briefly a photograph of Burke Stemmons that had the particular quality of an image pulled from a company website. The kind of photograph a man takes when he still believes he controls how he's seen. I watched for 3 minutes. Then I turned off the television and stood in the kitchen and looked at the Fox River through the window. The water was the color of slate. A thin shelf of ice had formed at the near bank overnight. How long have you known this was coming? I asked. 3 weeks, Constance said. Franklin was notified by the FBI contact when the arrest warrant was issued. We waited for the public announcement. A pause. Grace wanted you to hear it the way everyone else would on the news in the morning at home. Of course she did. Gerald Foss arrived at the Geneva house at 10:15. He was a quiet man, 70s, a retired notary and estate document custodian, who had worked with Grace's attorney network for 20 years. He had the manner of someone who has spent a long career handling things that matter to other people and has learned to carry that weight without being crushed by it. Grace had given him one sealed envelope 18 months ago with one instruction. Deliver this on the day the FBI goes public, not before. He handed me the envelope, shook my hand, and left without staying for coffee. He seemed to understand that the moment didn't need company. I opened it at the kitchen table. Grace's handwriting. Half a page, the letters slightly uneven later in the illness. I could see now when the medication affected her fine motor control, but not her clarity. I built the trap. Henry. I said every piece of it, and I watched it for 2 years, and I believe it will work. But I couldn't write the ending. That part was never mine to write. It belongs to you. It always has. Whatever you decide to do with what's left of this, do it as yourself. Not as the man who was angry and not as the man who was afraid. As the man who stood in a kitchen for 40 years and understood that the most important thing about a meal is who you choose to share it with. I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. Gee, I sat with the letter for a long time. The river moved outside. The house was quiet in the way it had become, not empty exactly, but shaped around an absence. Constance called again at 11:40. Jackson filed Chapter 11 this morning, 90 minutes after the FBI announcement went public. Her voice was carefully neutral. His attorneys filed on an emergency basis. They're arguing the liquidated damages claims and any civil actions related to the government contracts should be stayed pending reorganization. A pause. He's trying to use the bankruptcy to slow down the civil exposure while he assesses his criminal liability. Will it work? For the civil claims, possibly for a time. For the FBI investigation number. Chapter 11 doesn't touch the criminal case. Another pause longer. This is outside what Grace planned for Henry. She accounted for a Chapter 11 filing in the abstract, as you know. She didn't account for Jackson filing on the same day as the FBI announcement in direct response to it. Constance's voice was steady, but I heard something underneath it that I hadn't heard from her before. Not uncertainty, but deference. What would you like to do? I looked at Grace's letter, still open on the table in front of me. That part was never mine to write. Give me an hour, I said. I didn't call Constance back. I called Jackson. He picked up on the first ring, which told me everything about what the last 3 hours had been like for him. Dad. His voice was flat and stripped of the polish I'd been hearing for 11 years. The MBA cadence the River North register. The particular tone of a man who has learned to perform confidence so thoroughly he's forgotten what it felt like before. What I heard instead was something younger and much less certain. I know what you filed this morning, I said. I know why. And I know it won't do what you think it will do. Silence. Jackson. I kept my voice even, not cold. I'd had months to move past cold, and cold wasn't what this moment needed. The FBI has had an arrest warrant ready for Burke Stemmons for 3 weeks. Your bankruptcy filing doesn't touch their case against you. What it does is make you look like a man who ran when the door opened. I paused. I'm going to offer you something once. I won't offer it again. I told him what I was proposing. Withdraw the Chapter 11 filing. Cooperate with the FBI fully with documentation without reservation. Give them Burke Stemmons and the 14 transactions and everything else in the Delaware account records. In exchange, I would not pursue the civil breach of fiduciary duty claims against him personally. And I would write a letter to the federal prosecutor documenting his cooperation and requesting that his individual sentencing, if it came to that, reflect the assistance he'd provided. I could not promise him an outcome. That wasn't mine to give. But I could promise him that a man who handed over everything and stood up and said, I did this, and here is all of it, was standing in a different place than a man who filed emergency bankruptcy motions on the morning of an FBI announcement. Why would you do this? Jackson asked. I thought about it for a moment. Not the answer, I knew the answer. I was thinking about how to say it in a way that was true without being a performance. Because your mother asked me to, I said, and because I'd rather you had a reason to become someone different than a reason to spend the rest of your life being exactly this. The line was quiet for 15 seconds. 20. Okay, he said. By 4:30 that afternoon, Burke Stemmons was in federal custody. Jackson's attorneys had filed the voluntary dismissal of the Chapter 11 petition at 2 p.m. The FBI had confirmed Jackson's cooperation status to Constance's office by 3. I sat on the back porch as the light went off the river. The air was cold and clean and smelled of the particular early February combination of frozen ground and the faintest suggestion of something that wasn't quite spring yet but was thinking about it. Grace had designed every layer of it. set every piece of it, watched it for 2 years. I was the one who decided whether to spring it or open the door. I had opened the door. I sat there in the cold and turned that over. Whether it was the right call, whether right was even the correct measure for a decision like this. Whether wisdom and weakness were sometimes indistinguishable from the inside, I genuinely didn't know. What I knew was that I had made it as myself, as the man who had stood in kitchens for 40 years, as the man Grace had filmed through doorways and called, "That's it, just like that." That had to be enough, for now it was. Jackson called 2 days after Burke Stemmons was taken into federal custody. His voice was different, lower, slower, stripped of the River North precision that had been his register for the better part of a decade. I stood at the kitchen window and listened, and I thought, this is what it sounds like when something breaks through. I was wrong about that, but I didn't know it yet. He came to Geneva on a Thursday. No lawyer this time. No leather portfolio, no black sedan. He drove himself in a car I didn't recognize something ordinary, a rental or a friend's, and he was wearing a gray sweater and jeans, and he looked standing on the porch, like a man who had finally run out of costumes. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table. He talked for 2 hours, about Northwestern, about the private equity years, about Burke Stemmons and how the relationship had started, not as a conspiracy, he said, but as a friendship. The kind that accumulates debt slowly until you look up one day and realize you've agreed to things you can't clearly remember agreeing to. He talked about the phone call in 2022, the one Grace had overheard. He said he'd told himself it was just business. He said he'd been good at telling himself things. He talked about the dinner in 2013 when he'd called the restaurant a hobby. He said he'd known it was wrong when he said it, and had said it anyway because he was 22 and freshly credentialed, and frightened that if he admitted his parents had built something real, he'd have to reckon with the distance between what they'd built and what he was. I was ashamed of the wrong things, he said. I listened to all of it. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't offer him easy absolution because Grace had taught me that the most dishonest thing you can do for a person in pain is to relieve it too quickly. But I listened. And somewhere in the second hour, while he was looking at the table and not at me, I felt something shift the particular quiet that arrives when anger finishes burning and leaves something older and sadder behind. He stepped outside. At one point, "I need some air, give me 2 minutes," and I stood at the stove and refilled the coffee. I didn't think anything of it. 2 minutes, give or take. I heard the back door close and then open again. I looked out at the river while I waited and thought about the step stool and the chef's knife and the small hands I'd held in mine a long time ago. When he came back in, he looked steadier. We talked until dark. When he left, I stood on the porch and watched his car disappear down Riverside Drive, and then I went inside and called Constance. "He came," I said. "He said things I believe he meant. I want you to file the formal letter of support. Request leniency based on cooperation. Do it properly." She was quiet for a moment. "Are you certain?" "No," I said, "but do it anyway." 10 days later, Constance called at 8 in the morning. "Franklin flagged something last night." Her voice had the precise, careful quality it took on when the information was serious. "There's a wire transfer, initiated from a brokerage account associated with the Delaware LLC Stemfield Capital Partners. $2.3 million moved to an account in the Cayman Islands." A pause. "The transfer timestamp is from the afternoon Jackson was in Geneva." I sat down. "The afternoon he was here?" "Yes." Constance let that land without editorializing it. Franklin cross-referenced the timestamp against Jackson's phone records from that day which the FBI had as part of the cooperation monitoring. At 3:47 p.m., the window when he stepped outside for air, Jackson made a 40-second call to a number in Nassau. 18 minutes later, the transfer was initiated. Automated prearranged, it only needed the trigger call. She paused again. "He set it up before he came to see you. He came to Geneva to give himself an alibi and to buy enough time for the transfer to clear." I didn't say anything. Outside, the Fox River moved. A cardinal was on the fence post at the edge of the garden, red against the gray February sky, perfectly still, looking at something I couldn't see. He set it up before he came. The gray sweater, the ordinary car, the 2 hours of things he'd said that I had chosen to believe because I had wanted to believe them. Because I was 67 years old, and he was my son, and I had been looking for a version of him I could hold on to since 2013. He had known that. He had used it. He had sat at Grace's kitchen table in the house she had built for me and made a 40-second phone call while I refilled the coffee and walked back through the door with steadier eyes. I sat with the phone against my ear and felt something I hadn't felt in this entire process. Not grief, not anger, not the complicated sadness of a man watching his son make choices he can't stop. Something simpler and colder, the clarity that comes when you stop hoping for a different outcome and accept the one in front of you. Send everything to the FBI, I said, all of it. The timestamp, the Nassau call, the Cayman account, Franklin's documentation, everything. Henry, don't ask me again, I said. Send it. FBI agents arrested Jackson Calloway the following morning at O'Hare International Airport Terminal 1 at 6:52 a.m. He was at the United Airlines check-in counter with a carry-on bag and a leather document case containing asset transfer agreements for 3 Miller's Express subsidiary accounts. His destination was Nassau, Bahamas. Constance called to tell me. I was sitting on the back porch in my coat with a cup of coffee that had gone cold watching the river. I had opened the door for him. Grace's door, the one she'd built into her plan, not as a trap, but as an exit, a way out of the story he'd been writing for himself. He had walked through it, looked around, and used it to run. I thought about something Grace had written in the letter Gerald Foss had delivered. Whatever you decide to do with what's left of this, do it as yourself. I had done it as myself. I had offered him what I genuinely had to offer, and I had sent the evidence when the evidence was what the moment required. Some people I thought not to, anyone just to the river, just to the cold February air. Some people aren't ready for the door you open. Maybe they never will be. I didn't know if that meant I'd done the right thing by opening it. I didn't know if the question had a clean answer. I finished the cold coffee. I went inside. I started breakfast. Sandra called on the first Monday of April. Outside the Geneva house, the Fox River had changed color overnight. That particular shift from winter gray to something greenish and alive that happens in early spring, when you're not quite paying attention and then suddenly can't miss. I was at the kitchen table with coffee when my phone rang. "Henry," she said, "are you ready to cook in front of a camera?" I looked across the room. The leather apron hung on the hook by the back door where I'd moved it from the bedroom sometime in February, close enough to the kitchen to be part of it, which felt right. I'd been wearing it on Sunday mornings, not for any particular reason, just because it fit and because some things belong in the rooms where they were always meant to be used. "Give me the address of the renovation crew at the Rusty Can," I said. "I need to see it first." Owen Beckett met me at the building on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April. The exterior was unchanged, the same corrugated metal, the same weathered sign, the same block of Pilsen that smelled of spring mud and diesel, and the faint sweetness of whatever the bakery 2 streets over had in the oven that morning. Grace had specified through Constance's office that the outside of the building was not to be touched. Let it look like what it is she had written in the renovation brief. The inside is the story. The inside had been transformed. The upper floor, where I had first found the capping machines and Grace's desk and the iron floor plate, had been gutted and rebuilt as a professional kitchen studio. The production lighting was installed, but not switched on yet, and the morning light coming through the cleaned skylights was enough to see by, falling across the space in the same pale rectangles it always had. Only now they landed on something that made sense of them. I stood in the entrance and didn't move for a moment. The walls were brick, not new brick, but the original industrial brick of the building, cleaned and repointed and left exposed. The color of it was a particular warm red that I recognized the way you recognize a voice before you place the name. The shelving along the north wall was open steel, the kind with adjustable brackets, arranged in the configuration I had used in every kitchen I'd ever run, because it was the configuration that made the most operational sense, and I'd never found a reason to change it. The stove was centered on the south wall position, so that a person standing at it faced the room. I had stood at a stove positioned exactly like this, facing a room exactly this size in a kitchen on West Randolph Street in 1989. The first restaurant. The one Grace and I had built from the catering operation, the one we'd opened on a Thursday night with 12 tables and a menu. Grace had designed on a legal pad and a line out the door that neither of us had expected, and both of us had quietly hoped for. The brick was the same color. The shelving was the same configuration. The stove was in the same position. Grace had not renovated the Rusty Can. She had rebuilt 1989. Owen said nothing while I stood there. He was good at that, understanding when a room needed to be occupied quietly. After a few minutes, I walked to the stove and set my hand on the cold iron surface of the nearest burner, and just held it there for a moment. Then I put on the apron. I had carried it from Geneva in the bag I'd brought for the day, not because I'd planned to wear it here, but because it had started coming with me the way certain things do when they become part of how you move through the world. I tied the strings the way Grace had always tied hers, at the front rather than the back, which she'd told me once was more practical, and which I'd adopted because she was right, and I'd never found a reason to stop. I reached into the front pocket. There was something in it. A folded piece of paper thicker than notebook paper. Recipe cardstock, the kind Grace had used for 40 years because she didn't trust thinner paper, near a stove. I unfolded it. Saffron risotto. Her handwriting, the earlier version, steady and slanted from years before the illness, had changed the fine motor work. The recipe itself was one I knew by heart, had known for decades, but she had written it out in full anyway, with the particular margin notes she used when she was writing something for someone else rather than for herself. Small arrows pointing to timing details. A note about the saffron bloom it longer than you think you need to. Patience is the whole point. At the bottom of the card below the recipe in different ink added later, start here. You always start with what you know best. I stood in the kitchen she had built me and held the recipe card she had left in the pocket of the apron she had saved for 26 years. And I felt the particular quality of being completely located in a place, in a life, in a story that I hadn't felt since before September. We filmed the first episode on a Wednesday in the third week of April. Sandra had a crew of 4, small and efficient the way she ran everything. The production agreement with Meridian Food Network had been finalized in March. 24 episodes technique, and memory, the working title, Henry's Table. A licensing arrangement with a major food distributor had come in during the negotiation process, adding a financial layer that Sandra explained, and I largely left to Owen and Constance to manage. What I understood was that the numbers worked, that the project was real, and that Grace had set this in motion 22 months before I knew it existed. When the kitchen smelled of butter and saffron, the stock warming on the back burner, the arborio toasting in the pan, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't memory exactly. It was more like the way a key feels in a lock when the tumblers align, a small mechanical recognition, entirely physical below the level of thought. The smell of butter browning and saffron blooming in warm stock was the smell of every kitchen I had ever built anything in. The first rented kitchen on Ashland Avenue, where Grace had said, more basil. Henry always more basil. The restaurant on West Randolph in 1989. The Evanston House on Sunday mornings. The catering operation in Bridgeport. Every beginning compressed into one particular combination of heat and fat and spice, and the patience of something made slowly. I wasn't remembering a specific morning. I was remembering why we had started, why we had kept going, why Grace had spent the last 2 years of her life making sure this would still be possible after she was gone. I stood at the stove and I understood it, not as information, but as something felt the way you feel a temperature change before you can name the number. Ready, Sandra called from behind the camera. Her voice was warm and professional and unhurried, the voice of someone who understood what she was watching and was giving it space. I looked down at Grace's handwriting on the recipe card, the slanted letters, the margin notes. Start here. You always start with what you know best. I reached for the ladle. Ready, I thought. For the first time in a long time, genuinely, solidly, without qualification, I was ready. We finished filming the final episode on the last Thursday of September. I know the date mattered exactly 1 year after the night I'd stood outside this building in the dark with a rusted key and nowhere else to go. I didn't mark it with anything ceremonial. I didn't make a speech. When Sandra called, cut on the last shot of the last episode, I turned off the burner, set down the spoon, and untied the apron strings the way I had tied them at the beginning of every shooting day for 6 months. Sandra's crew started breaking down the lighting rig. Someone put on music. The kitchen smelled of the last dish, a brown butter sage sauce over handmade pasta that had nothing to do with the episode's theme but had seemed like the right thing to make on a last day. I think Grace would have agreed with that logic. Owen had handled most of the Kraft Heinz negotiation, with Constance reviewing the contract language. The final terms had been signed in August, a 15-year licensing agreement covering the 5 USPTO registered formulations, the Henry's Table brand, and the associated recipe methodology. $2.1 million annually structured as quarterly payments into the Callaway Family Living Trust. Owen had called me the morning the countersigned agreement came back and read me the number twice to make sure I'd heard it. I had heard it. I wasn't sure what to do with it yet, which Owen said was a reasonable response, and that we had time to figure it out. What I understood was this Grace had spent 40 years building something. I had spent 40 years helping her build it, mostly without understanding the full shape of what we were making. The licensing agreement was not the point of any of it, but it was a measure, a particular kind of confirmation that what she had believed about the value of what we'd made together was accurate, and that the people who had tried to reduce it to a hobby or sell it below cost to a Delaware LLC had simply been wrong. I drove back to Geneva the afternoon after we wrapped. The expressway was the same as it had always been, the skyline receding in the rear view, the flat land opening up as I moved west, the Fox River appearing in the distance like a landmark I had learned to navigate by. The trees along Riverside Drive had gone full autumn, red and gold in the late afternoon. Light, the kind of afternoon that makes you understand why people write poems about October in the Midwest. Harriet was raking leaves in her front yard when I pulled in. She waved and came over to the fence while I was getting my bag from the car. The particular directness of a woman who has decided that at 70, the social formalities that delay honest conversation are not worth the time they cost. "How did the last day go?" she asked. "Well," I said, "I made pasta." She nodded as though this was the correct answer. Then after a moment, "Have you heard anything about Jackson?" I set the bag on the porch step. The question didn't catch me off guard. Harriet had never been indirect about the things she actually wanted to know, which was one of the things I'd come to appreciate about her. It was also a question I'd had 6 months to develop an answer to. "He made his choices," I said. "I made mine." She looked at me for a moment with the particular assessment of someone deciding whether a person means what they say, or is performing, meaning they don't quite have yet. Whatever she found, she seemed to accept it. "Come for dinner this week," she said. "I have too much soup." "Thursday," I said. She went back to her leaves. I went inside. The kitchen was the way I'd left it, clean, quiet, the particular settled stillness of a room that has been lived in long enough to hold a person's habits in its walls. I put the kettle on and stood at the window and watched the river for a few minutes. The water was slower now, heavier, moving into the serious business of autumn with the deliberate patience of something that does not need to hurry, because it has been doing this for a very long time. When I turned from the window, I saw the chair. It was where I had left it against the wall beside the table, slightly forward from where it had been in August, as if it had moved a few inches on its own in the weeks I'd been absent. I stood and looked at it. The empty place it marked at the table was the same empty place it had always marked. It hadn't changed. I hadn't expected it to. I thought about moving it back against the wall, tidying it away, making the table geometry symmetrical again. I stood there with the kettle beginning to sound behind me, and I thought about it for a long moment. I left it where it was. There are things you don't put away because putting them away is a kind of lie, a false claim that the absence they mark is something to be corrected, something temporary, something that will eventually resolve itself into ordinary furniture arrangements and full tables. The chair was not those things. It was accurate. It was a true record of who was supposed to be sitting in it and wasn't, and I had lived long enough to understand that accuracy matters more than symmetry. The kettle clicked off. I made the tea. I sat at the table at my usual place with the river outside and the October light slanting through the window and the empty chair in my peripheral vision present without demanding. The way certain people are present even after everything. There are chairs that stay empty, Grace, I thought. Not as grief, or not only as grief, as acknowledgement. But that doesn't mean the table is any less full. I drank the tea. The afternoon settled into early evening. The chair remained where it was. For the first time in a long time, perhaps. For the first time since a Tuesday morning in September of last year, when I had stood in our living room and watched a version of the future I'd assumed I had disappear, I felt something I recognized as ordinary. Not healed, not resolved. Not the clean ending that grief is supposed to produce if you do it correctly. Just ordinary. Just a man, a kitchen, a cup of tea, the sound of the river doing what rivers do. It was enough. It was, I thought, exactly what Grace had been building toward. Henry's Table. Episode 1 aired on a Wednesday evening, October 8th, 2025. Exactly 1 year and 3 weeks from the night I had stood outside this building with a rusted key in my hand and a son who believed it was the most worthless thing in the world. I hadn't planned to watch it with anyone, but Owen called Monday, Sandra called Tuesday. Harriet arrived Thursday to ask what she should bring, which meant the question of whether I wanted company had been answered without my having to answer it. Dottie Crane drove up from the south side Wednesday afternoon, the first time we'd met in person, after 9 months of phone calls. She was smaller than I'd imagined and steadier. When she shook my hand, she said simply, "I'm glad he's all right." She meant me. I believed her. We gathered in the studio at 7:30. Owen brought folding chairs. Sandra brought wine. Harriet brought pie because Harriet always brought something and had decided that pie was appropriate for most occasions, which I had come to entirely agree with. I set up the playback screen Sandra's crew had left on the north wall. I had not watched a single episode in full since we filmed it. Tonight felt different. Tonight it was real. At 8 o'clock, the title card appeared. Henry's table. Then the studio kitchen, the one Grace had designed to look like 1989, lit in April morning light. And then myself standing at the stove in the leather apron reaching for a pan. My wife always said I cooked for everyone except myself. My voice unhurried. She wasn't wrong, but she fixed that too. Harriet made a small sound beside me, not crying, something quieter. Recognition. I watched myself cook. Familiar and distant at once, like reading a letter you wrote long ago and finding you still agree with it. The person on screen moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone who has done this for 50 years and has finally stopped waiting for permission to do it in front of other people. Sandra refilled my glass without my noticing. Owen said nothing for the entire hour, which was how I knew he thought it was good. Dottie watched with steady attention, and once when the camera caught my hands at the cutting board, she pressed her lips together, briefly in the way that means something without being sayable. Everyone left by 10:15. Harriet last with the unhurriedness of someone making sure a person is genuinely all right and not merely performing it. She looked at me for a moment with the full weight of 70 years of reading. People found what she needed, kissed me on the cheek and said good, and walked next door. I went back inside and started washing glasses. The studio held the warm residue of the evening voices gone, but not quite absent the way rooms carry people for a while after they leave. I moved through the end-of-service routine I'd done 10,000 times. Wipe the counters, stack the chairs, put away the cloths. The work that requires only your hands. I opened the lowest drawer of the prep station to put away a dish towel. There was a note at the back, folded once on recipe cardstock. I recognized the paper before I unfolded it. I recognized the handwriting before I read the words. "I knew you'd find your way back to a kitchen, Henry. You always do. Save me a seat at the table." Gee, I stood in the empty studio and held the note for a long time. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my breast pocket close. I turned to the long prep table at the center of the studio, 6 chairs pushed in along its length. I pulled one from the left side and set it slightly apart, straightened it, stepped back and looked at it. Then I turned on the stove. I don't know how long I cooked. Long enough for the studio to fill with warmth and the smell of something making itself slowly, the way good things always do. I cooked without a recipe, without a plan, without anyone to feed, or without anyone visible, which I had come to understand was not quite the same thing. Outside, Chicago was doing what it always does in October. Wind off the lake, a sky the color of old pewter, the smell of something changing in the air. Inside, the rusty can. There was a man at a stove, an empty chair, and 43 years of love that had never needed a lock to keep it safe. Grace had known that all along. The rest of us just took a little longer to find our way to the table. I'm not a man who talks about God often, but I'll say this once: I believe God was in the details. Grace left behind in the locked cellar the leather apron, the note folded in a kitchen drawer. No human plan is that precise. No human love is that patient. Something larger than either of us was holding the whole thing together while I wasn't paying attention. Here's what I know now as a man who learned it too slowly and too late. Don't be like me. Don't wait until your son calls 40 years of your life a hobby before you realize you never told him what it actually cost you to build it. Don't wait until someone you love is gone before you read what they left in the drawer. The drama revenge stories we remember longest aren't about anger. They're about the people who loved, quietly planned carefully, and trusted that truth would eventually find its own way to the table. These grandpa stories, these lives lived behind ordinary doors, in rented kitchens, and old warehouses carry more weight than most people recognize. I've lived one, and my honest opinion is this. The most powerful thing a person can do for someone they love is not to fight their battles for them, but to make sure they have something worth fighting for when the time comes. That's what Grace did. These drama revenge stories dressed in aprons and recipe cards are the realest ones I know. And these grandpa stories, I believe, are the ones that stay with you longest. Because somewhere in them you recognize your own kitchen, your own chair, your own drawer. You haven't opened yet. If this story left something in you, a thought, a memory, a question you haven't asked someone yet, drop it in the comments. I read every one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time because the next story is already waiting, and it begins like all the best ones do, with a door that looks locked from the outside. Thank you for staying until the very end. In a world that moves fast, that means everything. One more thing before the next story. Some of the narratives on this channel include fictional elements, names, details, timelines constructed to illuminate truths that are very real. If that's not what you came for, no judgment at all. Choose the content that serves you best. But if you're still here, pull up a chair. There's always room at this table.